Now this in itself may not be difficult to fathom for many people. However, this really is just the beginning. The ancient people may have even believed the mushroom to be the creator of all life on this planet. And I've also found evidence that the ancient people associated the mushrooms with the UFOs. No matter where we look in the ancient world, whether it's in the stories of the goddess and gods or in the ancient religions or the mythologies, we could be looking in Sumer, Babylonia, Akkad, Egypt, Turkey, anywhere in the Middle East, Iran, Persia, Asia, India, and it doesn't matter what religion we're dealing with. Judaism, Islam, Christianity, all of the goddesses and gods actually are just mushroom deities. Now it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Indra or Krishna or Buddha or Enki or Enlil or Marduk or Tiamat or Jehovah or Baal or Isis or Osiris or even Jesus or the Virgin Mary or John the Baptist. These all are actually just symbols and images and characters that are representations of mushroom deities. And the reason why I can say that with confidence is because I found images of all of these characters, all of these mythological deities, either depicted as a mushroom, holding a mushroom in their hands, or with mushrooms protruding out from their bodies somewhere. That's a total of couple thousand images that I put together that I have in my archives that show all of these mythological deities represented in some way as a mushroom. Combining the secret symbolism imagery with the myths themselves, the actual myths and the details of the myths, the book gives the reader the ability to go through and actually understand the myths for themselves so that they can come to their own conclusions and realize for themselves that these myths are dealing with nature and have nothing to do with ancient aliens. Now, it doesn't really matter whether these deities are storm deities, they're earth, they're wind, or fire deities, or perhaps they're volcanic deities like Vulcan in Rome, or they're phallic or fertility deities and goddesses and gods, or perhaps they're bulls or cows, or animal deities like the bird or the serpent goddess. All of these are still symbols and representations for the magic mushroom. Much of the information that the reader is going to be presented with in the video and in the book has been covered up for a long, long time by the secret societies, and it's what the leverage that they use, the knowledge and the power that they have over the individual that they use to control people in our society through superstition and myth. They've taken a lot of things that people speculate on and they turn those things into belief systems, which are then imposed on the people through various forms of mind control. So the people end up believing in things that are really just superstitions, kind of like we did back in the Dark Ages or during the witch trials. And some people may not be aware that all of the world's religions, whether they're Judaism or Christianity or Islam, they all trace back to older mythologies and mythologies of Sumer, Babylon, Akkad, Egypt, and even Greece. And each one is just a copy of the older one. So a lot of times, that's really what is very important to understand. When we look at fairy tales, we're seeing the same thing with fairy tales. They're all representations of mythologies, and in some cases the fairy tales represent religions too. It's all the same thing. It's all mushroom lore. It's also, I think, the understanding of many people out there that we've lost a lot of the ancient world mythologies, that they've been destroyed and never recovered. Places like Alexandria that have been destroyed and sacked during the Roman era. But it's not so well known that actually a lot of these mythologies have been pieced together by people because we've discovered, say, we've been missing parts of them in one location. We've actually recovered many of the other fragments from other locations. One of those being the Library of Nineveh. So a lot of the times that a lot of people will say, well, you know, we don't really know what's in the ancient stories, or we don't know all the ancient stories. There really weren't that many of these different ancient stories overall, and most of those have been recovered, and they all pretty much tell us the same thing. They're all dealing with nature deities. They're all dealing with the storms and the rains and the winds and the seasons, and you know, that's what it's all about. So when somebody tries to come along and say they've given a new interpretation, or they actually have an interpretation that properly interprets the Sumerian texts or the ancient texts, like somebody like Zecharia Sitchin. Well, he's not saying that he's reading the ancient world in a way that nobody is reading it in Sumerian. What he's saying is he's giving a new bend and interpretation on those texts. And that's what Eric von Daniken and Zecharia Sitchin have done. They've given new interpretations on some of these ancient things, but what they've been reinterpreting the whole time has been mushroom mythology and mushroom lore. So they've been reinventing it into a mythology of ancient aliens for the New Age. Now, I used to believe in ancient aliens, and I used to believe in the alien occupants of UFOs, that they were piloted by some kind of being that was living or something, and I used to buy into a lot of those things. But the ideas that I'm presenting in this video and in my book are a little bit different. One of the things that I discovered in putting all this information together, which I couldn't really get away from, was how the patriarchy had imposed itself and changed the course of history when we previously had a matriarchal and a matrilineal civilization throughout the world. So I don't get so much into that in the video. I go much deeper in my book, but I think it's a good idea to preface all of this, but because throughout the video, occasionally I'll be discussing this. So I just want to make sure that the viewer understands some of the background information about this and some of the discoveries that I bring out in the book, so they can understand what I'm talking about in the video a little better. Up until about 4,000 years ago, the world was not the way that we envision it and the way that we are taught it was. The world was made up of people who were earth-worshipping, goddess-worshipping, and they were in touch with nature through the mushroom and through the entheogens. They were in touch with the creatress and the creator. They were in touch with their maker through the psychedelics in the natural world. So in essence, they were very in touch with nature. And it was pretty much like that all around the world. There was even travel around the world a very, very long time ago, before the patriarchy had come about. And people had settled all around the world with their mushroom and their knowledge and their earth-worshipping based ideas. The ancient people understood that nature was a feminine principle, and that it was a creative principle because women gave birth. So women were the creatresses, and there were no creator male gods. Male gods had not been invented, not until about 4,000 years ago. Everybody was accustomed to the mushroom, everybody was used to using the mushroom, and it was no secret. It wasn't a secret, and the knowledge of the mushroom and what it could do didn't become a secret until the advent of the priesthood, and the priesthood came along with the patriarchy. A lot of the ideas that we have in the world today about how we form bonds and partnerships and relationships, marriages, get together and have children, those ideas didn't exist in the ancient world. There was no pairing of partnerships of people and marriages, and that didn't exist until more recently. Most people aren't aware that for tens of thousands of years, even hundreds of thousands of years, human beings didn't really know who their fathers were. That wasn't really a very important thing. Paternity wasn't established. While some of the top scholars in goddess mythology and history have argued that we didn't really know who the fathers were because we didn't know that men were part of the equation when it came to reproducing and having children, I wouldn't agree with that. I don't think that's exactly the way it was. I think rather that paternity just didn't really matter to the ancient people. The reason paternity didn't matter to the ancient people was because people weren't born from the man, they were born from the woman. That's just the way it was. People were raised up in tribal clans, and those tribal clans were families, and women got pregnant in those families, but they weren't necessarily matched up with anybody. They weren't paired up as in partnership. So paternity wasn't established, and paternity wasn't an issue, really. The way that it worked basically was that the people that were raised up in these tribal families, they held celebrations during the different seasons and the changeovers of the seasons, and that's where we get our first holidays or holy days. That's actually where our holidays come from, were these celebrations. And the patriarchal historians would call these celebrations today, they call them orgies. Now, we don't really have, I've been looking for that kind of evidence to show what were these celebrations really like, and really all we have is the mythologies. About the closest thing I've been able to find are descriptions of how Rome had turned into basically like a bacchanalian celebration every day, how the holiday of Saturnalia had been turned into an everyday occasion. So I think what they were saying is people were jovial, merry, and celebrant, and they were enjoying licentiousness, probably not much different than we do in our socially accepted form of celebration like Mardi Gras in New Orleans or Bourbon Street or something like that. We don't really have any reason to believe it was too much different than that, or that it was like we imagine, like wild sex orgies and everybody just doing everything all over the place. Essentially, these were like celebrations of love and fertility, but they weren't worshiping the nature deities like we've come to be told by a lot of the historians and scholars and some of the Christians and more conservative religious people. They were worshiping the creatress or the creator through nature, and through these deities, they represented the creatress or creator through different forms of nature, whether they were the wind, the rain, the fire, or the earth, or the elements, or the seasonal changes, whatever it was. And they were worshiping her, the creatress, through the mushroom and through the sacraments and through the entheogens. So the women would inevitably get pregnant during some of these celebrations, and as they would sometimes during their service to the goddess through maybe serving as a sacred prostitute in one of the temples, like the temples of Artemis or Isis or Aphrodite. And the children born from these sexual relations would just be raised up by the community. They'd be raised up by the men in the community and the women in the community in a shared responsibility. Now, the mothers knew, of course, who their children were because they birthed them and they came from them. But the fathers didn't know necessarily who they had impregnated and whose children they were. And it really wasn't considered very important either. So it would seem that it either became apparent at some point to the men that it would become in their interest to break away and form their strength in numbers and try to take control over their parental rights and to do something about that. Or possibly the situation came about from being cast out from the family clan and having to band together in order to survive and ending up becoming nomadic cattle herdsmen. By doing so, they could then have the mushroom be growing from the cattle dung, which they would always be transporting around with them. This seems to be how some of these early kingships ended up actually being started. It's also very likely that the men had the knowledge of the mushroom when they broke off from the original matrilineal clans, because what we see is the very first kingships start in Sumer and Akkad. It's also where we see the first mythologies from the Middle Eastern world, and we start to see ideas of deities that are male deities like Marduk conquering female deities like Tiamat, the great dragon of the deep. So it would seem that the first kingships coincided with the time period when the men had broken away from these matrilineal clans and had formed their own groups, and therefore their civilizations, what we call civilizations in Sumer and Akkad, these first civilizations, because they had cuneiform writing and things like that, these were just kingdoms of these patriarchs that had broken away. And what we find later on is that the Judaism spawned off from some of these same kind of patriarchal priesthoods that formed under these kingships, like the Levite priesthood, which really means the serpent priesthood.